I realize I'm kind of dashing through this because we got started kind of late and we got a few other things that we want to do. So let's talk about the drivetrain and the parts of the drivetrain. Now, as I said before, the seat is the beginning of the drivetrain. And that's not really the case with regular bicycles, but it is with recumbents. So if you're getting a noise that's following the speed of the pedaling, it might be coming from the seat. If it seems to be coming from under the seat or behind the seat, that's a possibility. You may have just the adjustment system, maybe one side of the supports is working loose. If the bolts that hold the seat on are getting loose, that's a serious concern. I mean, when a trike comes in for a checkover, that's one of the main things we check is how tight those bolts holding the seat are, because those can work loose, and if one of those goes loose, when you're climbing that hill or you're accelerating to get across that busy street, that's when something flies apart and you can fall down or bad stuff can happen. So it starts with the seat. The next step in the drivetrain, aside from your creaky knees, are the pedals. And if you're hearing a noise that tends to follow the main push on a pedal over the top, or a click or a squeak, oftentimes you can identify the problem being the pedals. And some pedals, you can rebuild them, you can oil them, but it tends to be the fancier pedals. Oftentimes, the pedals that have plastic bodies on them, they'll tend to go the fastest. There's aluminum body pedals too that just aren't rebuildable, everything's sealed. Stuff like that, you're just going to replace them. But I mean, you probably paid about $20, $25 for it, and as you know, if you can get out of the bike shop for only $25, you're in good shape. So pedals are, in many cases, a replaceable item, though some of the nicer ones are rebuildable, and you can get in there and grease them. Okay, next step is the crank set. The bottom bracket is that bearing assembly that's in there, and it's one of those very not sexy items of the bike. You can't really see it. Nobody cares if you've got a fancy bottom bracket, or only real nerds will care if you've got a fancy bottom bracket. But it's another part. It's got bearings in it. It takes a lot of force. Parts can wear out. Bottom bracket, the modern bottom brackets really only have two parts. There's a cartridge, which has all the stuff in it, and then a lock ring, which screws in on the other side. And I have seen plenty of cases where that's where the noise is coming from, where you got a creak that follows the pedals. It's actually the cartridge and the lock ring are just wiggling back and forth. Anytime we install a bottom bracket, we do sort of a chemical treatment on that to make sure that won't happen. But, the factory that builds the bike, I'm often rather appalled at what doesn't get greased on these things. And it raises the question for us when we're building it, how much time are we going to take on this? Are we going to take the whole darn thing apart and grease everything that the factory didn't? A lot of times that kind of depends on how expensive the bike is. And we don't always take everything apart and grease it. But, it's going to get serviced at some point in the next year or two. And so, if that gets changed out or if a problem develops, then it gets treated. But you can't always assume that all of this stuff is done when you get a brand new trike. Another thing that needs greasing are the crank bolts. Now, there's a lot of different designs of cranks out there now. Some of them have a separate bottom bracket that the two crank arms bolt onto. That's the traditional design. So if you see a bolt on each side, it looks the same on each side. That's the traditional design. And if those crank bolts work loose, then a crank can fall off. And it's another one of those drivetrain problems, like I said, with the seat. It tends to happen at the worst possible time. When you're really having to give it a lot of force, you're trying to get the heck out of the way of something, or you're trying to get started on a hill, that's when something flies apart, and you don't want your crank arm falling off. So if a crank bolt is working loose, that's another important thing that needs to be checked. If you're hearing a occasional noise coming from up there, that's something to check. Next part is the chain and the sprockets. Now, chains do wear out. If you don't oil your chain, it wears out faster. And if you let a chain wear out and keep riding with a worn out chain, well, it affects your shifting, but it also starts to damage your sprockets. Replacing a chain on one of these is about $75 up, just because there's so much chain. But if you start wearing out your sprockets, you're adding considerably to the price of that. I mean, one of these big chain rings up here is usually close to $75, just this itself. Now, usually, if something's going to get worn out, it tends to be the two smaller ones, because they're the ones that are used most. But if the chain is worn out, and the pitch of the chain, it should be 1/2 inch between the pins, but you start adding a few tenths of a millimeter to that, that's enough to start wearing down those sprockets. Look at the sprockets on your bike. Look at the cogs on your bike, and just get a mental picture of what that ought to look like. Because if it happens that they start not looking right, they start looking kind of pointy, you know that you've been letting things go too long, and you should get it to a shop, and you should be prepared to get your credit card out. But chains do wear out. They're expected to be a replaceable part. And then lastly, we get all the way back to the back. This is the Cog Set. You can also call it the cassette or the freewheel. Those are not the same thing. Cassettes and freewheels are not the same thing, but if you go to your mechanic and you wave your hands and say, there's a problem with my freewheel, they'll know what you're talking about, don't worry. If they sneer at you because you don't know the difference, go to a different bike shop. But the Cog Set, again, it's sprockets, they can wear out. The last part of the drivetrain is something you don't actually see, and it's the ratcheting pawl mechanism that connects the Cog Set to the wheel. It's the thing that lets you stop pedaling and still coast. The wheel can turn without pushing the whole drivetrain. But when that starts to wear out, which I don't see that many problems with that. I mean, I'm sure athletes who are pounding the tar out of their equipment wear that sort of thing out more than casual riders do. But we've got a bike in the shop right now. Lady commutes on it, and she's been commuting on it for 15 years, and I think she just finally wore out that hub. Because you notice you get a slipping in the chain. It's when you see that slipping in the chain, the first thing you think of is, well, maybe it's not quite in gear. The chain is not really lined up with the gear, and it's missing every now and then, falling between the gears. But if you got that happening in every gear, then you've probably got a problem with the ratcheting pawls. And that's something, you don't have to replace the wheel, it's just a part on the wheel. But it can be difficult for you to identify that because it's parts that you don't see. Okay? So, oh yes, and one more part of the drivetrain that I shouldn't leave out because it's another recumbent-specific thing. So, being recumbent-specific, if you're going to a regular old bike shop for your maintenance, you're not necessarily going to think about the idlers. Idlers, well, they can wear out, of course. What's more common is these idlers have some kind of wrap around them to keep the chain on it, and if that gets pushed out of position, you can get a lot of noise from that because the chain is dragging against an edge of it. So maybe you just unloaded it from the car or something, and you accidentally banged the bottom of the trike against the tailgate of the truck. Or it's a low-riding trike, and you rode it over some rough ground. There was a transition back to the curb, and something it hit the thing on the bottom, and now you're getting a lot of noise. The place to look is on that part there. Okay, before I start talking about the frame, any questions about the drivetrain? Because you can probably point out something that I missed. Roger, did you put your hand up, or were you just airing out your pits? All right, Gary will get with him for a moment. Any other questions about the drivetrain? All right. Yes?
You mentioned the chain wearing out. When should we start suspecting the chain might wear out? Is that a 500 miles, 1,000 miles?
I would say more like 1,000 miles. Now, if you don't take good care of your chain, probably sooner, but if you don't take good care of your chain, you're probably not thinking about checking the condition of your chain anyway. There have been cases of chains that have lasted up to 10,000 miles, and not even especially great chains. But chains their life is measured in thousands of miles. It's the kind of thing when you bring the bike in for an annual tune-up, that gets checked. When you bring it in for a quick check over, that's something we check. And it's easy to check with the right tools. We got the right tools. You can buy a chain checker. The main thing, what a chain checker does, is it sticks down between some gaps in the chain, and then you press on it so that it kind of spreads out these two little pins, and it measures the distance, and it's a tiny little measurement. The thing you got to remember about doing that is don't get too enthusiastic pressing those pins out. You want to do it very gently, because what happens is if you press real hard, the pins get bent inward, and it's going to under-report the amount of stretch if they're bent inward. So the chain can be really shot, and it's still going to be telling you that everything's fine. So if you use something, it's Park Tools tool that has that particular concern. I've seen other chain measurement tools that don't really have that problem, but anytime you're using a measuring tool like that, the assumption is that you're pressing lightly on it. You don't have to press hard. You don't want to wear out the tool.